The chill of an early October evening settled over Boston, fog curling through narrow streets like a restless spirit. Gas lamps flickered against the damp cobblestones, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. At the far end of a quiet alley, a small figure huddled beneath a tattered coat, knees drawn to the chest, breath forming clouds in the cold air. The child was no older than 8 or 9, yet there was something unsettling about the way they scanned the streets with eyes far too knowing, far too wary. Each passerby felt it instinctively, a shiver that ran down the spine, the quiet awareness that this was not a normal child, that something about them carried weight far beyond their years. A shopkeeper paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the brass handle, watching as the orphan muttered softly under their breath. Names drifted from tiny lips, each syllable precise, each one a name that had sent the city into whispers of fear or despair. Samuel Clark, lost to a fire 2 years prior; Abigail Hayes, vanished without a trace last spring; even the more notorious criminals whose faces had darkened the newspapers, each name emerged with unnerving clarity. The orphan's voice was soft, almost lyrical, but there was a rigidity to it, a certainty that no child should ever carry. The shopkeeper's fingers tingled on the metal handle, and he quickly retreated inside, whispering hurriedly to his wife about the strange, unnerving child outside. The child's eyes flicked toward the faint glow of a nearby lamplighter, tracing his slow arc along the street. With each step, the names continued, sometimes overlapping, sometimes whispered as though answering a silent question only the child could hear. Passers-by kept their distance, unsure whether to confront, avoid, or pretend not to notice. Some claimed to hear the child speaking of crimes that had occurred decades ago, cases that were supposedly forgotten, closed, or buried in records that no ordinary mind could access. Others insisted the child knew of events that had yet to happen, predicting disappearances or revealing secrets that even the most cautious townsfolk kept hidden behind locked doors. Inside the orphanage, the staff had begun to take note of unusual behavior. The child would wander the halls silently, pausing only where shadows seemed thickest, their eyes tracing patterns invisible to others. When questioned about meals or routine tasks, they would respond with information that was startlingly accurate, or terrifyingly prophetic. The adults attempted explanations grounded in logic, perhaps an extraordinary memory, perhaps overheard conversations repeated with uncanny clarity. Yet no matter the reasoning, the tension surrounding the child grew, a palpable unease that clung to walls, furniture, and whispered corridors. Even the older children seemed to sense that the orphan was not merely odd, but deeply, profoundly different. The fog thickened, and the streets of Boston became a labyrinth of half-seen shapes and shifting sounds. The child moved quietly, slipping between alleys, tracing patterns along the worn cobblestones that seemed almost ceremonial, ritualistic in their precision. The names continued to flow, each one punctuated by a pause that suggested a question, a silent dialogue with unseen forces or hidden truths. In that quiet hour, when even the city's most diligent watchmen paused in respect for the night's uncanny hush, the child's presence was felt more than observed. Shopkeepers, night workers, and late wanderers all reported a sudden chill, a prickling at the neck, the instinctive awareness that something beyond comprehension was moving through their midst. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Children whispered among themselves, sharing fragments of what the orphan had said. Adults debated whether this was divine insight, a cruel trick, or perhaps the work of a mischievous spirit. Some insisted the child had been sent by God to reveal the town's hidden sins, others swore that a darker force was at work, guiding the lips of one so young with knowledge too terrible to bear. Yet no one could deny the details, the names, the specifics. And when pressed for proof, the child would offer small confirmations, an item stolen and returned, a story recalled exactly as it had unfolded, a secret revealed that left listeners pale and trembling. Even the city's law enforcement could not ignore the phenomenon. Officers found themselves consulting a child who, in every practical sense, should have had no information at all. They spoke in hushed tones in their offices, debating whether to take notes, launch investigations, or dismiss the accounts as coincidence. But the child's knowledge was meticulous, precise, and often verifiable. Each revelation seemed to chip away at the comfortable certainty of the adults, forcing them to confront a possibility they would never have imagined, that the world of innocence might, in rare and terrible instances, carry a shadow deeper than any adult's experience could encompass. The night stretched, thick with mist and tension. Each step the child took seemed to echo, faintly, against unseen walls of the city, tracing invisible paths between past, present, and what might yet come. By the time the first lanterns flickered out with the dawn, the city had already begun to speculate, debate, and fear. No one spoke openly in the streets, but in quiet rooms and behind drawn curtains, people wondered how a small, frail child could possess such knowledge, how the innocence of youth could coexist with the weight of Boston's darkest secrets. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the child would reveal next, and whether the town would survive the revelation of truths it had long hoped to forget. By morning, the orphan had vanished from the alley, leaving only a lingering sense of dread and curiosity. But the names persisted, whispered in markets, bakeries, and taverns, as if the child had breathed them into the very air. And those who had heard them felt a cold, uneasy certainty, that this small figure, so easily overlooked in the crowded streets, had touched the deepest fears and memories of the city, leaving an imprint that would not fade with the sunrise. Boston in 1906 was a city of contradictions, a place where the clang of industrial progress met the shadowed corners of history, and where wealth and squalor existed side by side in uneasy harmony. Narrow cobblestone streets wound through neighborhoods like arteries, carrying the lifeblood of commerce and rumor alike. Gas lamps flickered along every corner, casting uneven light that blurred the edges of reality and shadow. The air carried the sharp tang of coal smoke, mixed with the faint sweetness of bread from early morning bakeries, while children darted between carts and alleys with a mixture of fear and curiosity. In such a city, secrets could hide in plain sight, and the past never seemed far behind, lingering in the worn brick facades, in the iron railings, in the echo of footsteps on the stones. The social structure of Boston at this time was rigid yet layered. The elite occupied stately brownstones with polished brass doorknobs and imported furniture, their lives measured in strict schedules and proprieties. Below them, immigrant families from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe juggled survival against the constant threat of disease, poverty, and exploitation. Orphanages and charitable institutions dotted the city, often overcrowded, their walls filled with children whose lives had been touched by loss, neglect, or abandonment. It was in one such place that the child appeared, arriving without explanation or documentation, yet immediately distinct from others by the uncanny focus in their eyes, the intensity of their awareness, and the eerie precision of their observations. Neighborhoods carried their own personalities and atmospheres. The North End, with its winding streets and tightly packed tenements, buzzed with the smells of freshly baked bread and salted cod. Children played in the shadows, their laughter mingling with the rattle of streetcars and the occasional bark of a dog. The South End contrasted sharply, with grander streets lined with rows of modest brownstones, where shopkeepers polished windows and merchants arranged wares with a careful attention to order. Both areas, however, were threaded with whispers of crime, disappearances, and unexplained events. It was in these spaces, crowded with human activity yet heavy with unseen tension, that the orphan moved, always observing, always silent, always knowing. The architecture itself seemed to speak of history and weight. Red brick buildings, scarred by years of soot and storm, stood beside newer, lighter constructions, creating a dissonance of old and new. Church steeples pierced the skyline, their bells tolling regularly to remind the city of time and morality. Industrial smokestacks puffed clouds of gray into the sky, a constant reminder of progress and the human will to dominate nature. In every corner, there were stories etched into the walls, from faded graffiti to memorial plaques commemorating tragic fires, accidents, and crimes. Boston was a city that could not hide its history, and for those who knew where to look, it offered a map of secrets waiting to be discovered. Transportation shaped the rhythm of the city. Streetcars clanged along rails, ferrying workers from tenements to factories, while horse-drawn carriages clattered over uneven streets. The city's harbor thrummed with trade, cargo ships unloading goods, sailors carrying tales from distant lands, and the constant smell of brine mixing with smoke. This convergence of movement, sound, and scent created a tapestry of sensory input that few could navigate with precision, yet the orphan seemed to glide through it effortlessly, noticing patterns and repetitions that others overlooked. Family life in Boston was equally complex. Homes were often bustling, filled with extended relatives, boarders, and apprentices. Meals were communal and modest, with little privacy. Yet even within such crowded spaces, the city's darker undercurrents were impossible to ignore. Newspapers chronicled crimes that shocked and fascinated, from petty thefts to grisly murders. Gossip spread swiftly through taverns, markets, and churches, making the boundaries between public knowledge and private fear porous and unpredictable. In such a world, the child's ability to know names, places, and events with unerring accuracy was both terrifying and inexplicable. Education, or the lack thereof, also shaped the city's character. Schools were formal and strict, emphasizing reading, writing, and moral instruction, often at the expense of creativity or independent thought. Orphans and street children received even less, frequently relegated to rote memorization and menial labor. Yet the child, despite their youth and lack of traditional schooling, demonstrated a mind capable of absorbing information far beyond what any teacher could provide. Every whispered rumor, every passing comment in a marketplace, every fleeting glance between adults seemed to be catalogued, remembered, and later recited with frightening clarity. The city's law enforcement apparatus was methodical but limited. Police officers patrolled streets in groups, relying on physical presence, eyewitness accounts, and intuition to maintain order. Crime records were kept in meticulous ledgers, but with no modern databases or communication technology, information was slow to circulate, and many details went unnoticed or unconnected. Into this environment came the child, whose knowledge bridged gaps that human systems could not, bringing attention to unsolved cases, forgotten names, and events that had been buried in the noise of everyday life. Public spaces also carried weight. Markets, taverns, and churches were venues where ordinary life intersected with extraordinary knowledge. In these locations, the child's revelations could not be easily ignored, and every word spoken carried a subtle shock, a reminder that innocence might conceal something terrifyingly perceptive. Shadows played tricks in these spaces, footsteps echoed with unanticipated weight, and the child's presence seemed to bend the atmosphere, drawing attention even when the crowd sought to move on. By the time evening settled again over the city, Boston had revealed itself as a living entity, its streets breathing, its history whispering, its secrets pressing against the thin veil of everyday life. The orphan, though physically small, navigated this complex web with uncanny assurance, touching corners of the city that others avoided or ignored. It was in this setting, rich with contrast, tension, and latent danger, that the story began to unfold, a tale of innocence intertwined with darkness, observation that bordered on omniscience, and a city unaware that it had become the stage for something deeply, unnervingly unusual. The orphan's sudden appearance at the local institution brought with it an immediate, subtle shift in the atmosphere. Staff members were first struck by the child's quiet demeanor, a composure that seemed too deliberate for someone so young. The boy, or perhaps girl, as the institution's records never fully clarified, moved through the halls with a patience that bordered on the uncanny, observing every detail, every gesture of the older children, and every whispered conversation between staff. At first, these observations were dismissed as natural curiosity, the heightened awareness of a child who had learned to survive on the fringes of society. Yet as days passed, small anomalies began to surface, and the innocence of youth became intertwined with a growing sense of unease. Meals offered a first glimpse into the child's remarkable attention to detail. While most children at the orphanage jostled for food, pushed aside smaller classmates, or chattered endlessly, this child ate silently, often leaving portions untouched yet commenting with unnerving precision about the timing of certain events in the past or names of people long absent. When asked simple questions, who left the laundry out? Who was in the kitchen last? The child responded with answers that were always correct, sometimes recalling details of events that had occurred weeks prior, sometimes of incidents that had been spoken of only in passing. Staff began to exchange wary glances, unsure whether to attribute these insights to an extraordinary memory or to something less explainable. The earliest whispers among the children themselves were cautious and laced with fear. Playmates reported hearing the orphan murmur names that no other child could have known, describing events they had not witnessed. A neighbor's missing cat was suddenly recounted with startling accuracy, including which alley it had been last seen in and how it had managed to climb the narrow fire escape. Such details, small as they were, established a pattern. Over time, more consequential knowledge emerged. Minor thefts were identified, arguments anticipated, and conflicts resolved before the adults themselves were aware of them. The institution, previously a place of routine and predictability, began to feel like a theater of uncanny insight, the child the reluctant narrator of events no one else could perceive in full. Staff attempted to rationalize the behavior through observation and recording. Notes were taken meticulously, often compiled in secret journals hidden in drawers or locked cabinets. Teachers, matrons, and caretakers sought to verify every claim, attempting to trace coincidences or account for the information as the result of overheard conversations or natural deduction. Yet the pattern of accurate predictions, precise recollections, and obscure knowledge resisted every conventional explanation. It was as if the child had absorbed not only facts but the very currents of life within the orphanage and its surrounding streets, reading patterns invisible to adults. The psychological implications for the child were subtle but unmistakable. Though physically small and frail, their demeanor conveyed a gravity uncommon in children so young. The weight of knowing, of consistently perceiving the unseen and recounting it with accuracy, was evident in quiet moments. When no one watched, the orphan would sit by the window, hands clasped, eyes distant, murmuring softly to themselves, tracing invisible paths along the fogged glass. Sleep came fitfully, and when it did, dreams were occasionally muttered aloud, fragmented memories of fires, missing persons, and stolen items, sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted by the child's imagination. Those who overheard were left unsettled, unsure whether to intervene or to respect the boundaries of a mind clearly burdened by knowledge beyond its years. Interactions with other children oscillated between fascination and fear. Some gravitated toward the orphan, hoping for guidance or insight, particularly in playground disputes or hidden games. Others recoiled, sensing an unsettling otherness that marked the child as different. Rivalry and jealousy emerged naturally, but were tempered by awe. A child who could recall stolen trinkets or predict the next argument held a subtle power, one that altered social dynamics within the orphanage in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Even ordinary daily routines became a lens through which the orphan revealed their extraordinary awareness. The simple task of sorting laundry became a catalogue of small mysteries, missing buttons, items mislaid, or messages left inadvertently by staff. Visitors to the institution were described in detail after the fact, often including their occupations, where they had come from, and snippets of conversation overheard, details that were sometimes later confirmed by the visitors themselves. The depth of observation, paired with the child's uncanny recall, blurred the line between coincidence and prescience, creating an environment charged with quiet tension. The first public attention began subtly. Word spread among local shopkeepers, errand runners, and neighbors of the orphan's peculiar aptitude. An elderly grocer, recalling an incident with a missing ledger, was stunned when the child correctly identified both the culprit and the location of the stolen items. Rumors began circulating that the child had knowledge of events and people far beyond what could reasonably be known, including details of crimes that had never been publicly reported or documented. Each confirmation deepened the community's curiosity while simultaneously intensifying their apprehension. As the days turned to weeks, the institution itself became a crucible for psychological and social tension. Adults were forced to navigate the complicated landscape of fear, fascination, and ethical concern, balancing the need to care for a vulnerable child with the pressure of a phenomenon that challenged their understanding of reality. The child's presence highlighted contrasts: innocence versus knowledge, vulnerability versus power, childhood simplicity versus the macabre weight of human misdeeds. Every action and reaction contributed to a slow, persistent unease that seemed to ripple outward into the streets, leaving an impression on anyone who crossed the orphan's path. By the end of this early period, it was undeniable that the child had arrived not merely as another resident of the orphanage but as a focal point for a series of unsettling events. Ordinary daily life became a canvas for the extraordinary. The simplest interactions, passing a broom, handing over a piece of bread, observing a visitor, were imbued with tension and expectation. The orphan, oblivious to some of the larger implications of their knowledge, carried on with a mixture of innocence and solemnity, leaving adults to confront the reality that what they were witnessing might not be explainable through logic, training, or conventional reasoning. By the time whispers began to spread through the streets of Boston, the child's presence had already become impossible to ignore. Neighborhoods spoke in hushed tones of a small figure who knew things no one should, whose voice carried the weight of unsolved mysteries and long-forgotten secrets. The orphan had moved beyond the walls of the institution, walking among the market stalls, alleyways, and narrow streets, observing patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. Every footstep seemed measured, deliberate, and strangely confident, as if the child had an instinctive map of the city, memorizing its crooked corners, shadowed alleys, and hidden passages. Children watched from the sidelines, daring each other to approach, while adults debated whether the stories were truth, coincidence, or the overactive imaginations of fearful citizens. Early accounts from witnesses varied widely but shared a common thread: astonishment at the child's knowledge. A baker, for instance, spoke of leaving a loaf of bread in the back alley, only to have the orphan recount in detail the theft of another item weeks before, naming not only the thief but the exact location where it had been hidden. Similarly, a laundress reported the child describing a dispute between two families that had occurred months prior, a story she had assumed forgotten. Even casual conversations carried weight. A passerby might mention a missing kitten or a recent quarrel, only for the child to respond with exact, previously unknown details. These incidents, repeated with consistency, blurred the lines between rumor and reality, compelling those who heard to take notice, whether they wished to or not. The reactions of townspeople ranged from curiosity to fear. Merchants speculated on the source of the child's knowledge, some whispering of divine inspiration, others murmuring of something more sinister. Parents warned children to keep their distance, unsure if exposure to such uncanny awareness might bring harm. Religious figures, too, took note, cautioning parishioners to interpret the child's abilities as either a divine sign or a moral warning. Even law enforcement officers, initially skeptical, found themselves pausing in hallways, considering the orphan's insights when reviewing unsolved cases or interviewing witnesses. The city, as a whole, began to shift in awareness, each individual caught between fascination and unease. The child's own behavior added to the complexity. Though interactions were often brief, each was marked by a quiet precision. When asked a question, the response was immediate, articulate, and demonstrably accurate, yet delivered with an innocence that belied the gravity of the knowledge shared. When no one asked, the child still spoke softly, muttering names, recounting events, or narrating encounters with people whose lives had intersected in ways invisible to others. Even small gestures, such as pausing to examine a footprint in the dirt or tracing a pattern of soot on a wall, suggested an attention to detail far beyond what could be expected of a child. It was as if the city itself whispered its secrets to them, and they listened with unwavering focus. Reports began to accumulate from diverse sources. A street sweeper described how the child correctly identified a series of petty thefts that had occurred near the docks, providing names, locations, and even the approximate times when the events had unfolded. A local tailor recounted the orphan correctly predicting the arrival of a customer and the exact nature of the request before the individual had even spoken. These incidents, each minor on their own, coalesced into a larger pattern, reinforcing the perception that the child possessed knowledge that was both precise and expansive. Ordinary life, once predictable and familiar, now carried a subtle undercurrent of anxiety. The influence of gossip cannot be underestimated. Markets, taverns, and public squares became hubs of whispered speculation. Stories were shared, often exaggerated, yet consistently centered on the child's uncanny ability to name individuals involved in thefts, disappearances, or other incidents. Neighbors recounted encounters with a mixture of fascination and dread, noting the intensity in the child's eyes and the deliberate cadence of speech. Rumors traveled quickly, shaping public perception before any formal record could validate the claims. The city's social networks, informal yet pervasive, ensured that even distant corners of Boston were soon aware of the orphan's knowledge. Psychologically, the child remained largely inscrutable. While adults projected fear, curiosity, or moral interpretation onto the behavior, the child seemed simultaneously aware and detached, navigating interactions with a subtle balance of engagement and observation. There was no evidence of manipulation, no attempt to deceive or exploit. The knowledge appeared to emerge naturally, spontaneously, almost as if the child were a conduit for a larger pattern that ordinary citizens could not perceive. This detachment heightened the mystique, creating a tension between accessibility and unknowability, intimacy and distance. The community's response evolved over time. Initial curiosity gave way to selective observation, as townspeople sought to witness the child's knowledge firsthand. Markets were watched, street corners monitored, and casual encounters scrutinized. Those who approached the orphan directly often reported a combination of awe and apprehension, impressed by the precision yet unsettled by the implications. Some attempted to test the child's abilities, posing questions or presenting fabricated scenarios, only to be met with answers that revealed both the limits and the unexpected reach of the child's insight. Each confirmation strengthened the sense of inevitability, the notion that ordinary explanations could no longer suffice. Even minor, everyday interactions became infused with tension. A child asking for directions might elicit a correct description of a route never traveled. A mother seeking lost laundry could receive not only the location but details of the person who had taken it. The ordinary rhythm of life was now punctuated by moments of extraordinary revelation. In the streets, on the steps of shops, in the quiet corners of alleyways, the child's presence altered perception itself, making citizens question what could be known, what should be known, and what knowledge might be too dangerous to possess. By the end of this period, it was clear that the orphan had become a figure of both fascination and trepidation. Witnesses, rumors, and personal encounters had solidified a reputation that was inescapable. The city, alive with commerce and chatter, had been subtly reshaped by the child's presence. Even those who had never seen the orphan directly felt the ripple of influence, the weight of names spoken, events recalled, and secrets revealed. What had begun as a quiet observation within the orphanage had now expanded into a public phenomenon, one that would shape the trajectory of the story, drawing in curiosity, fear, and the inexorable tension of suspense. Religious authorities and moral guardians were among the first to confront the phenomenon with deliberate caution. Sermons, whispered counsel, and private admonitions became commonplace as the story of the orphan spread. Clergy debated whether the child's knowledge was a divine revelation or a sign of corruption, a test of faith or an omen of misfortune. Some parishioners interpreted the murmured names and precise recollections as evidence of God's direct intervention, a way to expose sin and guide the community toward righteousness. Others feared darker forces, whispering that the child might be influenced by something malign, a conduit for knowledge that mortals were not meant to possess. These conflicting interpretations fueled tension, creating an environment in which devotion and fear intertwined with the everyday rhythms of life. Churches became quiet centers of speculation, filled with anxious parishioners who sought guidance or absolution. Confessions grew longer and more detailed, often prompted by a fear that sins long hidden might now be revealed through the child's uncanny awareness. Priests and ministers wrestled with the responsibility of interpreting events that seemed to exceed human understanding. Some attempted to observe the child directly, attending the orphanage under the guise of pastoral care, only to leave unsettled, unsure whether what they witnessed was divine insight, prodigious memory, or something beyond the explanations of faith and reason alike. Attempts to confront the child directly were often met with disarming innocence. When questioned, the child would answer in precise, matter-of-fact tones, offering names, dates, and locations that confirmed the stories circulating throughout the city. Yet there was no arrogance, no attempt to manipulate or deceive. The knowledge appeared to emerge naturally, as if the child were merely reporting truths observed and remembered. Adults were left to interpret the significance, balancing fear, awe, and moral responsibility in ways that weighed heavily on their consciences. The community's spiritual leaders began to warn that exposure to such knowledge carried a moral burden, urging discretion and vigilance, yet unable to provide definitive guidance. Rumors about the child's abilities spread quickly among the faithful. Some claimed miraculous insight, recounting stories of prayers answered or injustices revealed through the child's recollections. Others whispered of possession, curses, or bargains struck with unseen forces. In small homes and hidden alcoves, conversations grew hushed and conspiratorial, and the line between fear and faith became increasingly blurred. Every interaction, every observation, carried the potential for moral interpretation. A stolen loaf of bread, a missing button, or a whispered quarrel was no longer simply an ordinary event, it became a question of divine design or moral consequence, magnified by the child's apparent omniscience. The child's influence extended into the moral life of the city. Parents began to instruct their children with added caution, warning them that wrongdoing might be witnessed and reported in ways that were both immediate and impossible to ignore. Community meetings and informal gatherings were infused with a tension that had previously been absent, a sense that ordinary life might conceal hidden dangers now detectable by someone, or something, beyond normal comprehension. The boundaries between innocence and transgression, visibility and secrecy, morality and consequence were redrawn by the child's presence, subtly altering behavior across the city. Within the orphanage, the staff felt the strain of mediating between spiritual authority, local gossip, and the child's well-being. Teachers and matrons debated how best to respond, whether to encourage the child to speak, to limit exposure, or to seek guidance from higher authorities. Each choice carried ethical weight, as every revelation had potential repercussions. Attempts to confine the child's knowledge were often futile. The child's observations and recollections seemed to resist containment, emerging naturally and unpredictably, leaving adults both astonished and apprehensive. The tension between faith and reason became more pronounced as outsiders arrived, seeking to interpret the child's abilities. Scholars and physicians attempted to provide rational explanations, prodigious memory, psychological insight, or a heightened awareness of human behavior. Yet even as these interpretations were offered, religious leaders insisted on spiritual significance. The city became a theater for competing frameworks of understanding, each attempting to claim explanatory authority over a phenomenon that seemed to exceed conventional comprehension. Adults found themselves oscillating between hope, fear, and fascination, each response layered with moral and spiritual urgency. Reports of the child's knowledge began to challenge deeply held beliefs about innocence and virtue. Could a child truly carry such understanding without corruption? Were the revelations a test, a warning, or evidence of hidden malevolence? Ethical debates emerged in private homes and public spaces alike, as citizens questioned not only what the child knew but what the moral implications were for those who listened. Confusion, fear, and awe mingled in the air, shaping social interactions and personal behavior. Ordinary life was now punctuated with ethical deliberation, moral caution, and quiet observation, creating a pervasive tension that stretched across neighborhoods and social classes. Interactions between the child and clergy were marked by careful observation. Priests and ministers attempted to elicit testimony, asking the child to recount events in ways that could be interpreted as moral instruction. The child complied without obvious intent to influence, delivering accurate but neutral descriptions of crimes, disappearances, and neighborhood disputes. The adults were left to assign meaning, interpreting events as lessons, warnings, or signs, while the child remained largely unaffected, carrying the weight of knowledge with quiet solemnity. Each exchange reinforced the sense of the extraordinary, leaving observers both amazed and uneasy. By the end of this period, the city was steeped in a tension that combined curiosity, devotion, and fear. Religious authority and moral guardianship had engaged with the phenomenon fully, yet no consensus had been reached. Interpretations varied wildly, and debates persisted in hushed tones, in sermons, and in private gatherings. The orphan's presence had become a mirror reflecting the city's anxieties, its hopes, and its fears, revealing the complexities of faith confronted with the uncanny. The child, for their part, continued to exist at the intersection of innocence and knowledge, a quiet witness to human behavior, morality, and the fragile line between belief and dread. The city had learned, perhaps too quickly, that some truths could be observed without being fully understood, and that innocence and darkness could coexist in ways that challenged both faith and reason. As the child's reputation grew, public fascination transformed into something more intense, more urgent. Curious townspeople and journalists began to arrive at the orphanage in ever-increasing numbers, hoping to witness firsthand the phenomenon that had already infiltrated conversation across the city. Market vendors whispered to each other when a new visitor appeared, noting how the child's presence seemed to ripple through the air with subtle authority. Each person who came sought evidence, a glimpse, or confirmation of what had already become the subject of rumor. Even ordinary passers-by felt the weight of anticipation, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold, and that the small figure moving quietly through the halls or the streets could alter their perception of reality with nothing more than a spoken word. The psychological toll on those around the child was immediate and profound. Adults found themselves oscillating between awe and fear, drawn to the child's knowledge while simultaneously unsettled by it. Caretakers and staff struggled with a combination of pride and apprehension, aware that the child's insights could validate suspicions or reveal secrets they had long preferred to ignore. Merchants, neighbors, and minor officials who sought the child's counsel often left with an unsettling sense of exposure, a subtle recognition that their own actions, behaviors, and associations had been quietly observed, catalogued, and perhaps even judged. The orphan's presence introduced an invisible tension, one that persisted even after the individual had moved on, leaving a residue of unease that lingered in homes, shops, and streets. Journalists were among the most enthusiastic observers, bringing notepads, pens, and an unyielding desire for detail. They pressed for names, for dates, for accounts of events that ranged from petty thefts to more serious misdeeds. The child, however, remained neutral, providing information with a matter-of-fact precision that neither amplified nor diminished its weight. Every revelation carried a quiet authority, an implicit insistence on truth, leaving adults to grapple with the consequences. Editors debated how to frame the stories, balancing sensationalism with restraint, fully aware that public fascination could easily tip into hysteria. The city's newspapers, which had once reported crimes in a routine, formulaic way, now had to confront a narrative that was both extraordinary and unexplainable, challenging their capacity to measure reality against expectation. The child's own behavior during this period was marked by an increasing awareness of audience, though not in the conventional sense of performance. Movements were deliberate, gaze steady, and speech measured. When questions were asked, responses were precise, often citing details that astonished even the most skeptical observers. The child's understanding of human behavior, though derived from observation rather than instruction, allowed them to navigate encounters without overt manipulation. The presence of adults who wished to extract confirmation or provoke revelation did not change the fundamental nature of the child's insight. It remained consistent, calm, and unyielding, as though the information existed independently of both speaker and listener. Conflicts inevitably arose as the city's interest intensified. Some citizens, skeptical of the child's abilities, attempted to challenge or test them, presenting fabricated scenarios or deliberately misleading statements. Invariably, the child's answers revealed inconsistencies, corrected misperceptions, or supplied truths that unsettled the questioner. These moments heightened the tension, turning curiosity into a mixture of respect and apprehension. People began to recognize the fragile balance between knowledge and exposure, realizing that each interaction carried consequences that could be both social and psychological. Fear, fascination, and moral uncertainty intertwined in a pattern that was difficult to unravel, creating an atmosphere thick with suspense. The impact on the child was subtle but undeniable. With growing attention came signs of strain, long hours of observation, periods of silent reflection, and moments of withdrawal from both peers and adults. While the knowledge remained precise, the burden of constant scrutiny began to show. The child's small frame seemed to carry the weight of not only information but also expectation, the pressure to confirm rumors, to validate accounts, and to meet the unspoken demand for revelation. Sleep became more irregular, interactions with peers less frequent, and the quiet mutterings that had always accompanied moments of reflection grew more frequent, often including details that extended far beyond the institution itself. Local authorities were compelled to take notice. Police officers, initially skeptical, now approached the child for insights into unsolved cases, minor disputes, and neighborhood disturbances. While the child's information was never presented as judgmental, its accuracy often solved lingering questions or clarified ambiguous events. The city's social and legal systems, unprepared for such unorthodox assistance, began to operate under a subtle new paradigm, one in which knowledge could not be assumed to reside solely within adult comprehension or institutional authority. The orphan, in effect, had become a quiet arbiter of truth, reshaping human perception through observation alone. The interaction between public fascination and private unease intensified. Households whispered about encounters, speculating on whether the child had passed nearby, whether certain names might be uttered in the coming days, or whether a revelation could disrupt social equilibrium. Ordinary routines were now punctuated by moments of tension and expectation, as citizens became acutely aware that knowledge, once hidden, could now emerge without warning. The city itself seemed to bend around this awareness, a silent acknowledgement that life, order, and morality were now filtered through the eyes of someone whose comprehension transcended conventional understanding. By the close of this period, the child's public presence had transformed the city. Curiosity, fascination, and subtle terror had intertwined, creating a psychological landscape in which ordinary life carried new dimensions of awareness. Markets, streets, and private homes became venues of quiet observation, each citizen a participant in a network of knowledge and anticipation. The child, though still small and silent in many ways, had become both a mirror and a catalyst, reflecting the fears, secrets, and curiosities of Boston's population while simultaneously compelling them to confront realities previously ignored or forgotten. What began as fascination had evolved into a complex interplay of psychology, morality, and social dynamics, a slow-burning tension that promised further revelation and a lingering unease that would continue to grow. As the fascination surrounding the child deepened, rational attempts to explain the phenomenon began to emerge, drawing in scientists, psychologists, and criminal experts from across Boston and even neighboring cities. They arrived with notebooks, measuring tools, and skeptical eyes, intent on observing, recording, and understanding. The child was no longer merely an object of curiosity but had become a subject of study, placed under the scrutiny of human reason and the emerging science of psychology. Experts hoped to discern whether prodigious memory, heightened observation, or some undiscovered cognitive skill could account for the uncanny knowledge displayed, and yet, with every observation, the boundaries of explanation seemed to stretch further. Early experiments were simple, designed to test the child's recall and perception. Researchers asked questions about everyday events, requesting details of recent interactions within the orphanage or descriptions of objects and people visited over the preceding days. The child responded with remarkable accuracy, citing information that had not been directly witnessed, often recalling conversations overheard only in passing or noticing minute details of an environment that others failed to register. Observers noted that the child did not appear to embellish or fabricate, each answer was delivered with calm precision, as if the knowledge existed in a space outside of ordinary learning or perception. Psychologists attempted to categorize the behavior within known frameworks of cognition and memory. Could the child be a prodigy, a case of hyperthymesia, or a remarkable observer of human patterns? These theories were explored with diligence and caution, yet each explanation felt incomplete. When asked to recount crimes or missing persons, the child provided information that extended beyond standard observation, sometimes referencing events that had no public record or that had occurred in locations inaccessible to the child. The limits of scientific understanding at the time struggled to accommodate such phenomena, and a subtle tension arose between empirical rigor and the undeniable reality of the child's abilities. Criminal experts were equally intrigued, drawn by the potential implications for law enforcement. Officers and detectives presented unsolved cases, missing persons, and recent disputes, noting patterns and inconsistencies that had confounded conventional investigation. The child's insights often illuminated previously hidden connections, offering names, locations, or sequences of events that had eluded adult investigation. These revelations were delivered without flourish or judgment, yet carried a weight that challenged the authority of traditional investigative methods. Experts began to reconsider assumptions about human behavior, memory, and the accessibility of information, acknowledging the possibility that ordinary systems were inadequate to account for extraordinary perception. The child's responses, however, were never entirely predictable. While consistently accurate, the information provided was not offered on command. Attempts to extract data through prolonged questioning or manipulative setups often failed. Observers found themselves navigating a subtle, unspoken dynamic, one in which the child's attention and recall were selective, appearing at moments that felt almost instinctual rather than strictly responsive. This unpredictability heightened the mystery, creating a tension between what could be observed and what remained inaccessible, a reminder that knowledge, even when extraordinary, was not fully controllable. Reports of experiments began to circulate among townspeople, further amplifying public curiosity. Citizens followed the progress of scientists and detectives with fascination, debating the implications of the child's knowledge and the legitimacy of the tests conducted. Some embraced rational explanations, attributing the phenomena to an exceptionally gifted mind, while others leaned toward more mystical interpretations, believing that the child's abilities transcended science. These competing narratives created a complex social dialogue, reflecting the city's struggle to reconcile observation, faith, and reason. The psychological effects on the child became increasingly evident. Long periods of testing and observation introduced fatigue, moments of withdrawal, and occasional displays of frustration or anxiety. Despite this, the accuracy and depth of knowledge remained remarkably consistent, underscoring the persistence of the child's abilities. Caretakers and researchers alike began to recognize the ethical implications of prolonged scrutiny, acknowledging that while the pursuit of understanding was compelling, it could not be divorced from concern for the child's well-being. Observers were forced to confront the tension between scientific curiosity and moral responsibility, an uneasy balance that would shape every subsequent interaction. Interdisciplinary collaboration emerged, as psychologists, criminal investigators, and community leaders debated methods, interpretations, and potential applications of the child's knowledge. Meetings, both formal and informal, explored the boundaries of empirical testing, the risks of exploitation, and the possibility that the child's insights might reflect not only prodigious memory but a unique sensitivity to human behavior and environmental cues. Each discussion underscored the complexity of the phenomenon, emphasizing that the child's abilities could not be neatly contained within conventional paradigms of science, law, or morality. Attempts to document events systematically revealed both the potential and limitations of observation. Detailed notes, journals, and sketches captured sequences, interactions, and responses, yet the full depth of the child's awareness often eluded codification. Some phenomena, predictions of minor events, accurate recall of hidden or forgotten details, remained inconsistent with known psychological principles. Experts struggled to reconcile these discrepancies, acknowledging that even careful study could not fully account for the patterns emerging from the child's observations. The tension between documentation and lived reality became a central theme, highlighting the limits of human understanding in the face of extraordinary perception. By the end of this period, it was clear that traditional explanatory models were insufficient. The child's abilities had been tested, observed, and recorded in myriad ways, yet no single theory fully accounted for the precision, depth, or range of knowledge demonstrated. Rational inquiry, while illuminating in some respects, raised further questions, each answer leading to new mysteries. The city, through its experts and witnesses, came to recognize that they were in the presence of something rare, something that challenged assumptions about learning, observation, and the nature of human perception. What began as a search for explanation became a meditation on the limits of reason itself, a recognition that some phenomena resist categorization and demand contemplation rather than resolution. The city's fascination with the orphan reached a tipping point as the child's knowledge began to influence more than curiosity and private observation. Ordinary life, once predictable, now carried an undercurrent of anticipation and fear, as if the very streets of Boston had been transformed into a stage for revelation and consequence. Merchants adjusted routines, careful to monitor items and interactions. Families whispered warnings to children about misbehavior, knowing that the orphan's awareness might render secrecy impossible. Even casual passers-by felt the weight of the child's presence, sensing that everyday interactions could suddenly reveal hidden truths, moral transgressions, or unspoken secrets. Tension escalated further when small but significant events began to confirm the orphan's predictions in public settings. A missing parcel at a nearby dock was identified days before the authorities could investigate, with the child providing precise details of its location and the circumstances of its disappearance. A petty theft in a crowded marketplace was anticipated and resolved through the child's observations before panic could spread. These instances, repeated and verifiable, shifted public perception. What had once been rumor and fascination now demanded acknowledgement. The city, already alert to whispers and shadows, began to recognize the child not merely as a curiosity but as a force that could reshape their understanding of events and accountability. The child's influence also began to manifest in subtle social dynamics. Friends and neighbors adjusted interactions, mindful of what might be observed, anticipated, or revealed. Gossip, once casual and fleeting, became charged with caution, as the presence of the orphan suggested that secrets, even minor ones, could no longer be assumed safe. Public spaces, the market, the streetcar, the church steps, were now imbued with tension and expectancy. Each encounter carried the possibility of revelation, a reminder that knowledge, when wielded without malice but with accuracy, could nonetheless reshape behavior, relationships, and trust. Psychologically, the child's presence was transformative. Adults found themselves confronted with their own actions and moral choices, aware that a young observer, seemingly untouched by social conventions or fear of consequence, could perceive and recount both trivial and serious matters with unerring accuracy. Children, initially drawn by curiosity or play, began to recognize the weight of observation, their own behavior subtly altered by the sense of an unseen but omnipresent awareness. The orphan's abilities, neutral in intention, nonetheless exerted a profound influence on the city's social fabric, bending interactions toward transparency and forcing accountability in ways that no law, sermon, or neighborhood ordinance could achieve. Local authorities became increasingly cautious. Police officers and magistrates, initially skeptical, observed that cases previously stalled or unresolved were now clarified with the child's assistance. The orphan did not act as a judge or prosecutor but as a source of precise recollection, cataloging events, locations, and participants with a clarity that few adults could replicate. This unintentional mediation disrupted ordinary power structures, as the child's insights bypassed formal hierarchies and drew attention directly to facts and patterns that had gone unnoticed or ignored. Officials began to operate under a new awareness, their actions tempered by the realization that ordinary systems of observation and authority were inadequate in the face of extraordinary perception. Rumors about the orphan's abilities spread rapidly beyond the immediate neighborhood. News of accurate predictions, recalled events, and revealed secrets circulated through newspapers, letters, and conversation, shaping the city's collective consciousness. Individuals who had never seen the child personally still responded to the idea of their presence, adjusting behavior, conversations, and expectations in anticipation of observation. Markets, social gatherings, and private homes were now staged with an unconscious awareness of potential revelation, creating a citywide psychological shift. The impact of the child's abilities transcended proximity, influencing not just those directly observed but the broader perception of what knowledge could entail. Yet with this influence came friction. Skeptics questioned the accuracy of reports, attributing events to coincidence or selective memory, while others whispered of manipulation or hidden motives. Religious authorities warned of potential danger, cautioning that knowledge without moral guidance could destabilize the community. The child, however, remained neutral, neither affirming nor contradicting speculation. The tension lay not in the orphan's intent but in the human response. The city, confronted with an unprecedented convergence of observation and knowledge, grappled with consequences that exceeded control. By the end of this period, the orphan had shifted from being an object of curiosity to a central axis around which the city's daily life and moral consciousness revolved. The child's presence highlighted contrasts: innocence versus knowledge, authority versus observation, secrecy versus transparency. Ordinary routines were subtly altered, public spaces infused with tension, and social behavior influenced by the sense of constant awareness. The boundaries of privacy, expectation, and moral accountability had been redrawn without force or judgment, solely through the persistent, neutral act of observing and recounting events with precision. The city itself, caught between fascination and unease, had begun to operate under a new paradigm, one in which the smallest details of life could carry extraordinary significance. The city, already unsettled by the child's presence and knowledge, began to experience a subtle shift in its social and emotional landscape. Conversations carried caution, eyes lingered longer on passers-by, and familiar streets seemed shadowed with expectation. It was as if the ordinary rhythms of Boston had been interrupted, replaced by an underlying tension that no law, sermon, or social custom could fully dissipate. The orphan's ability to recall names, locations, and events with unerring precision had extended beyond curiosity, influencing behavior in public spaces, homes, and marketplaces alike. Each resident, whether directly interacting with the child or merely aware of their presence, became part of a network of observation, anticipation, and reflection. Neighborhoods whispered about what had been revealed and what might still come to light. Missing items, minor thefts, and personal disputes that had previously gone unnoticed or unresolved were now recounted with accuracy, prompting a collective reevaluation of trust and responsibility. Adults, once confident in their knowledge of the city and its residents, began to question whether they had overlooked subtle signs of wrongdoing or overlooked small but consequential details. Children, similarly, were forced to navigate a landscape in which ordinary mischief or secret play could be instantly known, catalogued, and acknowledged. The city's everyday life had become intertwined with an invisible sense of accountability, one that existed not in law or moral edict but in the quiet observations of a single child. The orphan's impact extended into the judicial and moral spheres. Local officials and law enforcement recognized patterns and connections that had eluded previous investigation, with minor cases often clarified through the child's insights. The information provided was neutral and precise, refraining from judgment or speculation. Yet the effect was transformative. Investigations proceeded more efficiently, disputes were settled with accuracy, and previously invisible threads of interaction were illuminated. Ordinary systems of governance and oversight, once assumed reliable, now felt inadequate in the presence of an extraordinary observer whose perception bypassed conventional constraints. Public spaces, previously ordinary in their rhythm and interaction, became charged with subtle tension. Marketplaces were no longer casual venues for commerce but arenas of careful observation, where merchants adjusted behavior to avoid misinterpretation or oversight. Streets were navigated with a heightened awareness of consequences, and homes felt the quiet intrusion of anticipation, a recognition that small, private actions might be catalogued and remembered. The child's presence reshaped human behavior not through coercion or explicit instruction but through the undeniable weight of knowledge, delivered with innocence yet capable of shifting perception and altering social dynamics. Despite this growing influence, skepticism persisted. Some citizens attributed the child's accuracy to coincidence, memory, or an extraordinary ability to infer information from subtle cues. Others whispered of supernatural guidance, divine intervention, or malicious manipulation. These competing interpretations created an ongoing tension, as belief and doubt circulated through the city's social networks. Each account, whether anecdotal or witnessed firsthand, added layers to the collective understanding, producing a climate of fascination intertwined with apprehension. The child, however, remained largely unaffected by human speculation, continuing to observe and recount events with a calm neutrality that only intensified the mystery. The psychological burden of this attention began to manifest subtly among adults. Merchants worried over seemingly trivial incidents that might be recorded, neighbors hesitated to discuss disputes openly, aware that the child could perceive details they had assumed hidden. Even minor social interactions, such as greetings, deliveries, or casual questions, were filtered through an awareness of observation. The presence of the orphan transformed ordinary relationships, making transparency and accountability unavoidable, and forcing the city's residents to confront the implications of knowledge that could not be concealed. As the community adjusted, a strange rhythm emerged. Public acknowledgement of the child's abilities was rare, yet private recognition was widespread. The orphan became a quiet arbiter, a point of reference for accuracy and truth without the need for authority or explanation. Residents adapted to a new equilibrium, balancing curiosity with caution, observation with discretion. This balance, however, was delicate. Every revelation carried potential consequences, and the city collectively felt the weight of living within a reality shaped by extraordinary awareness. Even minor events became charged with significance. Lost items were recovered, disputes resolved, and minor misdeeds accounted for before escalation occurred. Small acts of kindness or honesty were recognized and remembered, reinforcing the perception that the child's knowledge extended beyond crime or misfortune to encompass the broader spectrum of human behavior. The orphan's presence, though silent and neutral, had become a lens through which the city interpreted actions, intentions, and outcomes. Residents adjusted, whether consciously or unconsciously, aware that ordinary life had been transformed by observation that was precise, persistent, and impartial. By the close of this period, Boston had been subtly, irrevocably altered. Social dynamics, moral behavior, and public perception had all been reframed through the child's extraordinary abilities. The city operated with a heightened awareness of consequences and accountability, as though the unseen eye of observation had become an invisible force guiding daily life. The orphan, for their part, continued to navigate the streets, institutions, and homes with quiet precision, serving as both witness and catalyst, revealing truths without judgment and reshaping the community's understanding of knowledge, responsibility, and the fragile boundaries between innocence and awareness. The growing attention on the orphan eventually reached a point where the city itself seemed to respond as if alive with the anticipation of revelation. Streets, alleys, and public spaces felt different, each footstep echoing with a subtle tension, each glance potentially revealing what had been hidden. People moved with heightened awareness, conversations became more measured, and ordinary tasks carried the unspoken recognition that someone small, silent, and observant, was cataloging every detail. The child's presence had transformed Boston from a familiar, bustling city into a network of observation, anticipation, and unspoken accountability, where ordinary life seemed layered with unseen significance. The child's interactions with the public became increasingly delicate. Residents sought confirmation of past events or guidance on unresolved disputes, approaching the orphan with a mixture of reverence and fear. Merchants quietly asked about missing goods, neighbors inquired about petty quarrels, parents monitored the child's movements, concerned for both the child's well-being and the implications of their knowledge. Each encounter was carefully measured, the orphan's responses calm, precise, and neutral. The weight of information carried no malice, yet its accuracy had the power to reshape understanding, resolve conflicts, and expose truths previously obscured by time, forgetfulness, or social blindness. Despite the child's neutral intent, the psychological effect on the city's inhabitants was profound. Adults became acutely conscious of the consequences of their actions, often reconsidering minor misdeeds or unspoken thoughts with an awareness that the orphan might perceive them. Children, once free to play and misbehave without consequence, now behaved with careful attention, their actions tempered by the recognition of observation. Even those who never directly interacted with the child adjusted behavior based on the stories circulating through neighborhoods, a collective tension that subtly guided social conduct and reinforced the presence of an invisible, impartial witness. Authorities, too, adapted to the new reality. Law enforcement officers began to consult the child regarding unsolved thefts, missing items, and minor disputes, while clerical and administrative officials observed patterns in the orphan's knowledge that clarified complex sequences of events. The child's insights were neither manipulative nor coercive, yet they reshaped the conventional operation of authority, creating a dynamic in which formal power structures were supplemented, and sometimes circumvented, by observation alone. This shift in perception altered the city's understanding of truth, justice, and accountability, demonstrating that ordinary mechanisms were insufficient to capture the full complexity of social interaction. The city's social fabric underwent subtle yet pervasive change. Markets became arenas of quiet vigilance, families whispered moral caution, and even casual street encounters were approached with care. Gossip, once transient and superficial, now carried potential consequences, influencing behavior, decisions, and social standing. Ordinary life became interlaced with anticipation, as if every interaction could trigger revelation. The orphan's presence was not oppressive or authoritarian, it was a mirror reflecting the city's own choices and actions with unerring clarity, subtly transforming behavior without force or instruction. The psychological weight on the child became increasingly apparent. Days filled with observation, questioning, and scrutiny introduced moments of fatigue, introspection, and quiet withdrawal. The orphan often retreated to corners of the orphanage or streets, quietly tracing patterns or muttering to themselves. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by dreams that seemed to weave fragments of memory, overheard conversations, and imagined sequences into narratives the child replayed silently. Despite these burdens, the accuracy and precision of recollection remained unwavering, a testament to an innate capacity for observation and memory that exceeded conventional understanding. Skeptics persisted, attempting to reduce the phenomenon to coincidence, heightened perception, or learned behavior. Others speculated about divine influence, supernatural guidance, or intervention from forces beyond comprehension. These competing narratives contributed to the city's tension, creating an ongoing dialogue of fascination, fear, and speculation. The child's own neutrality, however, emphasized the contrast. Extraordinary knowledge could exist without intent, without judgment, and without explanation, leaving the community to grapple with the consequences of awareness itself. By this stage, even seemingly minor events held weight. Lost items were located, disputes resolved, and subtle patterns of behavior clarified through the child's insights. Ordinary interactions, delivering goods, offering greetings, or discussing trivial matters, were subtly informed by the recognition that observation was constant. The child became a quiet mediator of truth, reshaping social and moral dynamics by revealing information with precision while leaving interpretation to those who received it. Public life was thus transformed into a delicate interplay of awareness, accountability, and reflection, in which knowledge itself carried both authority and consequence. By the end of this period, Boston had shifted into a state of heightened awareness. The orphan's presence was no longer a matter of curiosity or rumor but a recognized reality that permeated daily life, reshaping behavior, social norms, and interpersonal dynamics. Citizens moved with measured caution, aware that secrets, intentional or accidental, might be observed and revealed. The city had been transformed into a web of observation and consequence, where ordinary events carried extraordinary significance, and a child, small, neutral, and silent, had become the axis around which understanding, anticipation, and accountability revolved. By the time the orphan's story reached the height of public consciousness, the city of Boston had been fundamentally transformed by the child's presence. Streets once familiar and casual now carried an unspoken tension, as if every passerby might be quietly observed, catalogued, and subtly judged. Ordinary routines, walking to the market, delivering goods, visiting neighbors, were layered with anticipation, a quiet anxiety born of the possibility that even the smallest misstep might be known, remembered, or remarked upon. The child's reputation had grown beyond rumor, evolving into a pervasive force that shaped perception, social conduct, and communal life. Citizens no longer interacted only with each other, they were conscious of the possibility that an unseen, extraordinary awareness hovered nearby, observing with precision, registering every gesture, every glance, every whispered word. Boston had been reshaped into a city where knowledge, observation, and consequence existed as inseparable forces, subtly but inexorably guiding the behavior of its inhabitants. The child, though small, silent, and unassuming, had become an invisible arbiter of truth. Adults, unsure whether to approach, question, or avoid, often consulted one another before any direct interaction. Merchants whispered among themselves, attempting to anticipate what the orphan might know about missing goods or mislaid transactions. Neighbors hesitated over minor quarrels, concerned that the child might possess an unerring awareness of past events, a record unbroken by time or forgetfulness. Parents warned their children, not out of fear of punishment, but from an understanding that misbehavior, however minor, could be observed, catalogued, and later recounted with chilling precision. What had begun as curiosity now imposed a quiet, relentless accountability upon the city's residents, altering behavior in ways both profound and imperceptible. The psychological effect on the community deepened with each passing day. Adults became increasingly conscious of consequences, reconsidering minor indiscretions or long-forgotten lapses, mindful that the child might perceive them and relay the facts to others. Children, once free to engage in harmless mischief or secretive games, now moved with calculated care, their actions tempered by the quiet knowledge that observation could not be evaded. Even those who never personally encountered the child adjusted behavior based on second-hand accounts, rumors, and the awareness of shared vigilance. It was as if the city itself had internalized the orphan's presence, becoming a web of observation and moral calibration in which transparency, accountability, and subtle social pressure replaced overt authority. The child's impact extended beyond casual observation into the judicial and moral spheres of Boston. Local officials and law enforcement officers found that long unsolved thefts, petty disputes, and missing items were suddenly clarified with startling precision. The child offered details of places, dates, and individuals without judgment, shaping outcomes and altering the course of minor events. While the child did not act as a judge or enforcer, the very act of precise observation introduced a new dynamic, one in which truth no longer required human enforcement to influence behavior. The city's social and legal frameworks were challenged, forced to contend with the reality that conventional structures of authority could be complemented, or quietly undermined, by an extraordinary observer who operated beyond traditional hierarchies. Public spaces became charged with a tension previously unknown. Markets, streets, and public squares were no longer neutral arenas, each interaction, exchange, or gesture carried unspoken significance. Merchants monitored their stalls with quiet vigilance, adjusting behavior to avoid misinterpretation or the revelation of minor failings. Children and adults alike modulated conversation, movement, and even tone of voice, conscious that the child's awareness might extend beyond immediate observation to subtle recognition of patterns, inconsistencies, or hidden truths. Ordinary life, once predictable and routine, was reshaped by an invisible presence whose neutrality amplified moral and social responsibility. The city's consciousness itself had been heightened, attuned to details that had previously gone unnoticed or unexamined. Skepticism persisted despite mounting evidence of the child's abilities. Some citizens insisted on coincidence, intuition, or subtle deduction, attributing accuracy to learned skill or observation rather than extraordinary insight. Others embraced mystical or supernatural explanations, speaking of divine intervention, providential knowledge, or otherworldly influence. These competing interpretations created a delicate tension, as belief, doubt, and fascination mingled within households, marketplaces, and public gatherings. The child's own neutrality served to intensify this tension. Knowledge existed without intent, precision without malice, and consequences unfolded without explanation, leaving the city to wrestle with the implications of awareness itself. The cumulative effect of observation began to manifest in subtle shifts across all social strata. Families became more conscientious, aware that secrets, even trivial, could no longer be safely hidden. Children acted with a new caution, their previous freedom tempered by the understanding that misbehavior could be observed and remembered. Public spaces operated under a quiet scrutiny, social interactions measured and deliberate. Ordinary life became interlaced with anticipation, as if every glance, every word, every movement carried weight. The orphan's presence, though never coercive, had effectively restructured society, producing an environment in which transparency and accountability were unavoidable. The child's own experience was marked by a delicate balance between observation and psychological strain. Extended periods of scrutiny, questioning, and interaction introduced moments of withdrawal, introspection, and muted reflection. The child often retreated to corners of the orphanage, quietly tracing patterns or muttering sequences of events under breath. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by dreams that blended recollections, overheard conversations, and imagined interactions. Despite the mental and emotional weight, the child's precision never wavered. Accuracy persisted in recalling names, sequences, and details, illustrating an extraordinary ability to maintain clarity and neutrality under constant social and psychological pressure. Religious and moral authorities remained deeply engaged. Some interpreted the child's abilities as a divine instrument, a moral compass revealing hidden truths and guiding reflection. Others warned that knowledge without understanding could destabilize the community, cautioning that exposure to unfiltered observation might be as dangerous as it was illuminating. The tension between the child's intent and the consequences of observation became a central theme. The orphan did not seek power, judgment, or influence, yet their existence imposed accountability on a city unprepared for such precise, unrelenting awareness. The boundaries between innocence and consequence, observation and morality, had been redrawn, leaving Boston's residents to navigate a reality in which ordinary acts carried extraordinary significance. As reports of previously unresolved events, disputes, and misdeeds continued to circulate, the child's influence extended beyond direct observation. Even those who had not personally interacted with the orphan adapted behavior, guided by rumor, example, or anticipation. Ordinary interactions, delivering goods, exchanging greetings, casual conversations, were filtered through the awareness that observation could occur at any moment. The city itself had internalized the principle of accountability, a collective understanding that behavior, intention, and consequence were inextricably linked. By the end of this stage, Boston existed in a state of heightened awareness, a slow-burning tension shaped by observation, consequence, and the persistent presence of one neutral witness. Trust, secrecy, and moral responsibility had been subtly but irrevocably redefined. Ordinary life now carried the weight of extraordinary significance, and the city's social, psychological, and moral landscape had been reshaped by a single child whose precision, neutrality, and persistence transformed perception itself. Citizens, whether directly aware or merely informed by rumor, navigated this altered reality with careful consciousness, understanding that the boundaries between innocence, knowledge, and consequence had been permanently altered by the quiet, relentless insight of a child who neither judged nor commanded, yet changed all who encountered them.